And thank you all for joining us today. I guess, hi, I'm Spencer and this is Mufseen. Together we form Queer Talk Podcast, an LGBTQ plus podcast that brings you positive news stories and fabulous interviews. We are delighted to be here today to talk to you all about the word queer and its multiple meanings. And I think we should just jump straight in and get to know some of our panellists.
Yeah, so we have 4 lovely panellists with us today. First up is Harriet Lunney, pronouns she, her. Harriet is a senior account manager at MSL Group. That's right?
That's right.
Got the first point. Harriet has driven inclusivity at work within the Publicist Group as a board member of the LGBT Business Resource Group and acting as a diversity and inclusion champion.
Next up, we have Alan Shannon-Smith, who uses he, him pronouns, Head of Student Advice and Immigration at the University of West London. Alan provides accurate advice and holistic support to students with regards to their finances and immigration status to allow them to flourish in their student experience.
Cool. Hi everyone, thank you so much.
That's me.
It sounds very impressive when people say that out loud. I don't think of it when I'm doing the day-to-day, but yeah. Hi everyone, and lovely to see you all.
And then we have Khadija Lewis, pronouns she, her. Khadija works for Frontline, a social work charity, working to ensure that all children in England have a safe and stable home. Khadija is a founder of Frontline's Black Affinity Group and an active member of the Frontline's Diversity Inclusion Action Group.
Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem. And last but certainly not least, we have Annie Gainsborough, who uses she, they pronouns. Annie is a project consultant at Gradconsult, and they specialise in graduate employment and talent management in the UK. They specialise in connecting educators with employers and delivering career workshops to students. So, hi.
Hello.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
So a great group of people, very well connected, well established in their industries, all doing great work in terms of diversity and inclusion.
So let's start the panel. Is everyone ready? So we're talking about the word queer, and I'd like to just go around the group and ask each and one of you, what does the word queer mean to you personally? So let's start with Annie.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I hear the word queer and when I think of the word queer, it tends to fill me with a sense of joy and belonging, really, which is not always something I feel about kind of other labels within the LGBT plus communities. But that said, I think queer is in some ways a bit of an anti-label. It's not just necessarily about sexuality, gender. It's about kind of how we live our lives, living outside the box, outside of the binary and the kind of constraints of heteronormative and cisnormative society. So for me, it's a political word. It's active. It's transformative. Which is why it's a word that I personally identify with, connecting me to those communities that yeah, I'm so lucky to be a part of.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. Yeah, Khadija, how do you feel about the word queer?
Yeah, so I guess the word queer to me, similar to what Annie said, is almost like a questioning of cis heteronormativity. And I think we need a lot of that questioning in society today. I really value the transition and the reclaiming of the word queer, but I also appreciate that not everyone identifies with the word. So a lot of my friends don't identify with the word queer. They would prefer to be called lesbians, gay, bisexual, whatever label they identify as. But I think the word queer gives us a choice. It widens our kind of ability to label ourselves if you do want to label yourself. So yeah, that's what it means to me. It represents choice and it represents a questioning of the kind of current system that we live in.
Yeah, I think it highlights that fluidity because our sexualities and stuff can change over time, and I think that's okay too, and it's a reminder of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Crush system. Because with anything, you can actually, any topic, you can queer that topic, which is what I love about it too.
Yeah.
So Harriet, how does the word queer feel for you?
Yeah, I think just adding on to that feeling of fluidity, I think it's a fantastic word for people who sit within that spectrum and are perhaps exploring their identity in different ways. It's a really strong, inclusive word. For me personally, even as someone who sits outside the community, I think hearing the word queer is inclusive, it's strong. Even though in the past it's had negative connotations, I think now that it's had this, it's been reclaimed, I think there's some strength in it. And I think to call yourself queer is fantastic. I mean, who wants to be normal and boring? I think be queer and fabulous, in my opinion. Exactly. So yeah, that's what it means to me.
That's why we're called Queer Talk.
Exactly.
Alan, how's queer for you?
Yeah, I think that kind of joining up with what everyone else has said already, I think that when I was younger, hearing the word queer used at school or on the playground, or if you were or in the street, it could be meant in a way that was an insult or an attempt to other you, and that was quite sad. So what's made me really happy is that I think over the last 10 to 15 years, the word has been reclaimed quite a lot, and it is now used to celebrate difference. As the other panelists have said, you can question kind of cisgender and heteronormativity in society and use the word as sort of a neat one word to capture fluidity of expression rather than I think using it to celebrate rather than other kind of people who don't fit into quite a narrow box. So my personal view of the word probably has changed over my lifetime, and I am and it is in a much more positive place, I think.
That's great to hear, and it kind of goes back to what Khadija was saying earlier, is some of us were bullied with that word, and it carries a lot of weight that we may not even realise. So hearing that kind of triggers us or makes us feel uncomfortable, and we have to appreciate that for a lot of people that is still the case. So there's a lot of reclamation of the word, and we're all it's very inclusive, but not everyone's going to feel like that, and it's really, we have to be mindful of other people, because it's great to hear that you've gone through that journey, but some people may still be on that journey or may not even want to go down that route.
Completely. And as LGBTQ plus people, I think we often face these barriers with discourse anyway. I remember, like, for me personally, the word gay was something I shied away from and was used against me as an insult. And we see that less and less today, but all of these identities, when we see them in stereotypes used against us, you know, having a lesbian haircut or something doesn't work, so it's being gay. It's those kind of things that are used against us, when actually there is nothing bad or negative about being gay or being lesbian or being any aspect of the LGBTQ plus community. So it's about, you know, looking at these words and going, wait, why is that used as an insult? Because I don't feel ashamed, or I shouldn't feel ashamed for identifying with those words.
So Aaron, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to kind of add to that. I think that if you choose to express yourself in a certain way, also if you are just being your true authentic self, and there are so many different cultures in the world where different signs and different stereotypes mean completely different things, that I think it almost becomes, it's really silly to insult people and to kind of belittle people for the way that they choose to express themselves, and to draw assumptions about the way people expressing themselves means a certain thing about who they are or their identity and so on, because around the world, different traits and different stereotypes and different preferences mean completely different things. So yeah, I think that it's a good word to kind of just encapsulate kind of stepping outside of the narrow box that sometimes society tries to place us in.
Yeah. So this is a question for all panelists. Have you ever used the word queer today in today's society and had a negative reaction? And are you mindful of using the word either in your workplace, in society, at university? Have you ever had a negative reaction or a positive reaction to the word queer?
I think just moving on from what Alan was saying, I think as someone who sits outside of the community but is very mindful as an ally to make sure that, you know, I'm doing and saying the right things, because otherwise I'm not being an ally, I am conscious of using the word queer. As we've spoken about, I would never want to say something that would be offensive. What I have been learning is, especially with younger people, the word queer is definitely more accepted, and they feel like it's a word that better defines kind of how they're feeling. And I think in particular with all of our kind of our roles and the audiences that we primarily speak to, it's a lot of young people. So I feel more confident using it now, especially kind of when talking about the community. You usually say LGBTQ+. So, you know, it's a letter and a word that is being pushed forward and being more accepted. But yeah, I've always been worried about, you know, saying the word initially, because like I said, I would never want to say something that would be offensive. Like we were saying before, saying, you know, somebody's got a lesbian haircut, or saying someone looks gay or something. It's just, you know, these stupid words that, you know, people use to insult, and then when you take that ownership back, there's so much power in it for the community to use for good, and for them to take that ownership. But again, like I said, being on the outside trying to do the right thing, you never want to cause offence. So there is kind of that mindfulness there that, you know, sometimes I need to make sure that it's saying it to the right audience, really.
100%. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think touching on what Alan said, like, because it's a journey, I think it allows that stepping stone for certain people. But some people's journey started way before any of ours did as younger people. So it's just being mindful, like you said. But it's really good for you as an ally to the community to take that time and to just take a breath and you know, pay attention to your surroundings, I guess, to make sure no one feels uncomfortable in those conversations and spaces.
Yeah, definitely.
I think even also when you're inside the community as well, because our identities are so varied, we're just kind of lumped together by an acronym or like a word, but our experiences and lived experiences are so varied that when we use language, we have to be mindful that we don't offend people. So for me personally, I usually use kind of hold a mirror up to someone. So if this term that I would first of all use is LGBTQ+, but then if the person I'm speaking to says the word queer to refer to themselves, I would then refer to us as queer people. But in order to not offend, I'll feel it out first and see how that person feels about it. And I think, yeah, different people have different ways that they relate to language. And I think if you can be intuitive about how you engage with people, it's a little bit harder when you're thinking wide scale and large scale. But on like impersonal interactions, I think it's always nice to reflect what that person feels comfortable using.
Yeah, you mentioned like some of your friends don't identify with the word queer; they prefer the label of lesbian or bisexual. Have you had a negative reaction? Was that a difficult conversation to have, or was it something that came quite easily, just, you know, understanding each other and rolling with that?
Yeah, it was. I think the first conversation I've had like that was quite difficult because I felt as though I offended my friend, and I felt really bad. But she actually just said, like, we're friends, we can have this conversation. Like, I can tell you that I don't want to be referred to as queer, and you don't have to feel like you've offended me. And I think that's when I really realized that although we are lumped together by a similar lived experience and we sit outside of this cis heteronormative like kind of ideal that society puts on us, we are going to have different ways of living. So let's just have these conversations and make sure that we are fluent in this conversation, and learn from each other. So yeah, that first conversation was difficult, but other ones that I've had since then have been a lot easier. And I didn't center myself in it, because I think that's when it becomes a bit poisonous.
Yeah, it's great that you were able to have that discussion with your friends. Because the worst thing you could have said is, "Oh no, you are queer."
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think although for me the term queer represents community, it is also such an individual choice, as you say, you know, how you identify and what labels you use to describe yourself. But interestingly, I think the only times I've really had negative reactions to the words have been by people outside of the community who've said, "Oh, is that really," you know, and almost questioned me in saying, you know, "Is that really a word you should be using?" Whereas I've been speaking to a few young people recently to hear kind of their thoughts on the words in the run up to today, and I think two things have stood out for me in their kind of discussions and thoughts on the word. And one is that idea that it really represents a broad community or communities of people, and and represents the communities becoming perhaps more inclusive of everybody that might be covered, particularly by the kind of the plus of LGBTQ plus, and actually having a word, an umbrella term that does bring all of those people together. And the second thing I think I've brought out of those conversations is a kind of the safety of the word. It can be helpful and validating because you don't have to out yourself by specifying where you kind of fit in that community, in those communities, because it covers gender, it covers sexuality, it covers so many other aspects, that there's a kind of safety in that. So I've slightly gone off topic there, but I think, yes, it's interesting to hear, you know, individual and definitely important to respect individual preferences and beliefs and feelings about the word queer, but there also is a power in the way that it can bring people together and make people feel safe and kind of belong within that word.
I like using the word queer because for me, as someone in the LGBT community, using the word queer is also saying to trans folk, non-binary folk, like, I am also an ally to you from within the community.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think it often can be difficult because the individual labels are important. Obviously, each aspect of the LGBTQ have their own difficulties and lives and you know, ways of navigating spaces. So it is important to have that separation sometimes, but I do like that the word queer brings people together. I think as a community, what we need to do is be more supportive of each other, which doesn't always happen. And then the word queer will feel more inclusive. Yeah. So I just want to ask the next question to Annie. As someone who is always having these kinds of conversations with employers and with students, could you shed some light on what it's like to be queer within the workplace? Yeah,
sure. I think, and I recorded a video recently for the Queer Student Awards about kind of my experiences of coming out in the workplace. And I've definitely been on a journey with that. Not gonna lie, it's still often a source of anxiety because coming out is never a kind of single event. It happens, you know, every day, every time you're meeting new colleagues, new clients, new students. And you know, I have had some unpleasant experiences or well-meaning colleagues who kind of accidentally out you because they don't, you know, just because you've come out to one person doesn't mean you necessarily want to be out everywhere. And sometimes, you know, it can be exhausting to feel like you're the person that constantly has to do that. But at the same time, I feel that I've come to a point where I'm in a really privileged position to be taken seriously, to be able to have these conversations with employers, with students, with colleagues, and to be able to offer my experiences and help people learn and grow. And I'm, you know, I don't think anybody should ever feel they have to do that or they have to take that role. It's not our job to educate the rest of the world, but I'm happy to do that as almost a kind of perhaps an ode to my younger self, or other people out there who don't feel in that position, don't feel safe enough to have those conversations. And I think the other side of it is that, as a couple of people have mentioned, being queer isn't necessarily just about sexuality and gender. It's about the way you live your life and exist, and the kind of pushing back against boundaries and binaries, and that comes into the way I work as well. A kind of bravery to ask questions and challenge the status quo, think outside the box and do things differently. And I think that's an attribute that has really helped me in the workplace, to be able to do what I do and build relationships with colleagues and solve problems and kind of move forward in other ways that kind of aren't necessarily specifically about my sexuality or gender, but still an integral part of me and my identity and being queer.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally, like, when I was at work, like, I think when you said that you can come out to one person, but you don't necessarily want to come out to everyone, like, I never really thought that, because I might feel comfortable about coming out to one person, but I don't want to start a whole gay rumour mill around the office.
Pride parade.
Exactly. Or if I've come out to my colleagues, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm comfortable coming out to our clients or you know, people I don't know so well. I mean, I'm fairly publicly out now, but that hasn't always been the case.
Yeah, it always takes, you know, a bit of time. It can take a long time as well to feel comfortable in those spaces. It's hard enough starting a new job full stop, never mind starting as a queer person who, you know, you have to announce your identity to, you know, your colleagues and different people, because those conversations do manage to come up time and time again.
Definitely.
So it's about making sure that you are, you know, having those conversations when you feel safe to, and making sure that, you know, everyone can kind of respect you, you can respect them, and kind of form an understanding for each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
So to the rest of the panelists, do you have any similar experiences in the workplace of being queer or supporting queer?
My, I guess, work being like my career journey has focused, I guess, less on my queer identity and more so on my blackness. But I think recently there's been more of a push towards kind of focusing on intersectionality. So what it actually means to be a Black, feminine presenting bisexual woman, how does that make me present in the workplace? I think I'm very lucky that the charity sector is known for being very open. So I've never worried about my safety or being accepted because of my sexual identity. But I think being at that intersection can sometimes can cause a little bit of anxiousness when you're not sure how you're going to come across, and I think that's the case for everyone, but especially when you're just unsure about the stereotypes that are come across, people having those kind of questions that you know that are on their mind but they would never ask you, and it almost comes across as a microaggression. But yeah, I think for the most part I've had a very kind of comfortable, very privileged to have that good experience since I've started my career.
Yeah. Slightly moving on from that, Khadija, you've done a lot of work in diversity and inclusion within your organisation. I wonder if you've kind of seen the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, the commercialisation of pride and queerness. So whilst it's accepted, has your organisation, or have you seen other organisations just trying to, you know, commercialise that and profit from it?
Yeah, do you know what? Luckily, I haven't seen that in my organisation. With like Frontline they do things with meaning, which is I really enjoy that, and they're very receptive to feedback. So if we feel like something seems a bit performative, someone will tell them, and something will be done about it. But what I have noticed since the 1st of June is that you scroll down LinkedIn and there's just rainbows everywhere. And as much as I love a rainbow, as much as the next person, I just think like, what are you doing to work with queer people to empower them? Do the queer people at your workplace feel safe? Like, these are the questions that I'm having when I'm seeing all these rainbows on LinkedIn and when I walk past the Lloyd's branch. So yeah, I've seen the commercialization of queerness, and especially around pride, but I'm grateful that I haven't actually had to battle that in my workplace, and I guess it's more so about how do you contribute to conversations that change that commercialization outside of work, for me anyway.
Yeah, the rainbow thing I definitely see on LinkedIn. I think my profile all went rainbow from every single employee that I worked with, which is great to see, but I definitely know that I've never always felt included.
Exactly. Yeah.
But commercialization, like, I think as LGBT people, like, think about maybe 40 years ago, it's amazing that so many companies are supportive of the LGBT community. That's great. But I think what I sometimes say is the work needs to be done all year round. It needs to be done with your employees, with your clients. Can't just be slapping a rainbow on. Like, that's a great start.
But it's not the end. It's not the end.
Absolutely. I think it should be a chance to be able to share, celebrate, demonstrate the work that has been going on for the rest of the year. Maybe a kind of, an extra opportunity to promote it rather than a publicity marketing tool. Otherwise it is kind of hollow and tokenistic. But as you say, I think we have come a really long way in that is seen as something that so many companies are willing and want to get involved in and share.
Yeah, something that's kind of important around this is, obviously when you're safe to do so, if that's your organization, is trying to have those conversations, because just slamming them like, listen, this isn't enough, full stop, we're out, we don't, we're not on board with this, isn't always helpful. I understand it's not our job to constantly educate everyone on everything, but having those conversations with employers, with organizations, and kind of giving them a little nudge in the right direction might push them to do the right thing. So whilst it's clear, and I think we're all on the same page, that slapping a rainbow logo on in June isn't enough, it's about telling them what could, you know, what could be done and maybe what they could do instead.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we don't want to stop companies being allies, and being an ally is actually quite difficult sometimes, knowing how to do it right. But it's, as queer people, like we've said it all, can't educate people, but we can guide people in order to understand and work together how to be an ally. So it kind of leads me on to a question for Harriet. As a self-proclaimed Jill, what was it like growing up around and supporting the queer community as an ally?
Yeah, so I always say I've been an ally since the age of, I think, 6 or 7, when I was told that my uncle had a boyfriend. And I was like, okay. It was never explained to me. There wasn't a big hoopla about it. It was just like, yeah, you know, your uncle who lives in London, blah, 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 he's got a boyfriend. I was just like, all right, okay, cool. And that was it. And that was just kind of how it's always been. So kind of growing up knowing that, and then getting older and actually understanding what that meant, and I was like, oh right, okay, so he's gay, right, okay. And then, you know, as seeing queer people in films and in TV started to become a little bit more popular, with things like Queer as Folk and, you know, and other TV shows and other representations starting on TV, I started to kind of piece things together. And then as I got older, becoming a teenager, going to university and actually spending more time with queer peers and truly understanding the struggles that people face, was a bit of a slap in the face to me. I was like, why are people not talking about this? This is awful, what people have been through, what people still go through to this day. And I just thought I would never want someone to do that to my uncle. I would never want someone to do that to any of my friends, so I'm never going to stand for it. And it's just something that it's a feeling that I've carried through my entire life, even to this day. So I've tried to educate myself as much as possible. RuPaul's Drag Race is not the only way to show you're an ally, and I think people need to watch more documentaries, read more books, watch more films, listen to more podcasts like you guys, and really understand the full spectrum of the community's experiences, those lived experiences. And I think that's truly educating yourself is the best way to show you're an ally. I think as well, being proactive and not performative is super important. Don't just, you know, do your pride post on Instagram on the 1st of June to be like, hey, look at me, I'm an ally. That's not enough. Like, what are you actually doing? Are you donating to charities? Are you being involved in conversations like this? Even to the point of, are you being there for your queer friends if they've got a problem? Are you there to listen? I don't think it's my place to give advice. I don't think I can ever give advice. I will not ever go through the experiences that people in this community have, but you should be there to listen and be there. And that's what I try to do as much as I can. And then kind of going back to talking about in the workplace, every role that I've had, I've always been involved in the LGBTQ plus like business resource group, because I always feel like I'm part of that community, even though I'm heterosexual, really boring, and even now in my current role, being a board member of our business resource group and really being able to try and promote change within the business and starting to have conversations with our executive board on a policy level, I think is really fantastic. So, you know, we're starting to have the conversation around, for example, parental leave and what the parental policies are, not paternal or maternal. Parental, what does that mean for same-sex couples? What does that mean for people adopting, surrogacy, everything? So, you know, really having those conversations that are going to help people's lives. And I think as an ally, you don't have to be doing these massive things if you aren't there yet, if you don't feel comfortable. But I think listening and educating yourself is really important. And also, yeah, be part of the community as much as you can, whether that's in person. Hopefully we'll keep going in person, or virtually, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially, yeah, listening for sure, but also people like you know, shouting from our corner is really helpful because often we're not taken seriously. So if you have someone who's an outsider as such, you know, preaching what we need to hear, people sometimes listen to that and go, oh, okay.
Harriet cares about this, so maybe
So
I should.
Yeah, and I'm very loud, so they should listen.
But yeah, those
think
conversations are vital. So really, really, really grateful you're out here, you know, cheerleading for all of us.
Every
I
day.
think it's so meaningful to have allies who genuinely, like, you can see the sincerity when Harriet's speaking, and we all value allies so much who are genuinely like there to listen. And if you can feel that genuineness coming from someone, then having a conversation, there is no bad question because you know it's done from a place of genuinely wanting to kind of like share an experience and so on. So I think I'm really happy to have like genuine allies, and they're so important for us as well.
And I think you're absolutely right, Harriet. There's big scale things and institutional changes which, you know, need to happen, but actually there's also a kind of private side to it, the individual conversations, things that are overheard in the corridor, the fact that you share or talk about queer media that you're listening to or watching or learning about, is just as important, and can, I think, coming back to the workplace as a queer person or a queer young person kind of moving into the workplace, can be the things that really make the difference and really make you feel safe and included, are those small things, those little conversations, just as much as the kind of big policy changes and kind of flashy actions as well. So kind of both of those things are needed.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's important to remind, you know, allies and us as allies to other people in our community that you don't need to change the world. You don't need to go out and like cure and fix everything in one go. It's okay to start locally, have conversations with friends, and, you know, slowly ripple out. It sometimes feels overwhelming, like, wow, there's so much bad in the world that needs fixing. Oh, I should go out and do it. None of us are superheroes, but we're all superheroes in our own right. So doing that locally is definitely a good place to start.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do feel like a superhero. So I'm going to wrap up the discussion part of the panel. And I just want to say thank you to everyone. And it's been a very insightful conversation. And it's great to hear from everyone's different perspectives on the word queer and the importance of diversity, inclusion, and allyship. We do have some questions that we'd like to share from the audience. So Spencer, would you like to?
Yeah, let's jump straight in. If anyone else has questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. I don't know if we can get people's microphones on if they want to ask them in person, but drop them in the Q&A box so that we can put them to our panel and get them answered for you.
So this is an open question to anyone who feels like answering. So in the same way queer can feel exclusive to someone, I have many friends with the LGBTQ community who really dislike the acronym and the labeling it infers, particularly for people who are still working this out or indeed exploring/changing. Really tricky when trying to do larger scale comms rather than individual conversations. Any advice or indeed alternatives?
I'm happy to jump in with this one, although I think that conversation's from Rebecca, my colleague, so we can definitely continue it afterwards. But I think one thing I'd say to that is that sometimes the kind of language or labelling doesn't always need to come into it, and it's more about the actions you're taking, about more generally using gender neutral language, or showing allyship and support in different ways that don't necessarily have to be shouted about and have a label put on them and become a publicity campaign. If you're doing those things, they will be noticed, and can still make people feel included and supported, even if they're not at a place where, or won't be at a place where they want to label themselves, or kind of still figuring out their identities or changing within that. So I think sometimes it's the actions that we're doing speak louder than the kind of specific language that we choose to kind of promote it with.
Yeah, completely. I think it's important also you know, if you're doing larger scale comms, to say more vaguer questions, you know, do you feel safe at work? Do you feel included at work? You know, do you feel represented at work? It doesn't need to say like, oh, all the queer people, please reply to this email about your feelings. You know, it can be directed at everyone. You should care about your entire workforce equally, I guess. And then, you know, you'll get that feedback and you'll be able to, you know, respond accordingly.
So we have another question. Whilst the conversations surrounding language choices are very helpful for the LGBTQIA+ community, do you feel some of the discourse could be halting genuine progress? So many intersections of the community need. So do you think the choices of language is actually halting any progress for the LGBT community?
In my opinion, no, because I think there's always an inclusive way to say something. And if you choose that way, like Annie said, you can then include more people in the conversation. I actually think you can hold back a conversation if you use the wrong language, then people don't feel like they're safe to contribute. So yeah, I always think I very much agree with what Annie said. Like, I think there's always a way that you can say something that includes everyone, or it kind of speaks to the people that you want to speak to without using terms like LGBTQ, queer. So yeah, I think language is very, very important when you're trying to get honesty from people.
Yeah.
And language isn't a static thing either. I think that over the past 10, 15, 20 years, and longer than I've been alive, language and the way that we kind of categorize people, label people, and kind of try and open those labels up evolves, and it will keep evolving as well. So I think that we're certainly not at the end of the journey yet. So I think the discourse is the progress because we're not finished yet.
Sure. Sorry, go ahead.
I think we also shouldn't be, because of that, we shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes. You know, we want to try not to get things wrong, but if we do, you know, like that conversation, Khadija, you talked about with your friend and Harriet, you know, trying to make sure you're using language that people are comfortable with. You know, we want to try and have that conversation and listen. But if somebody does say, you know, I don't like that word, or maybe you should do it this way, or offer some advice, we can say, you know, that's great, thank you for sharing that with me, and move on and learn from that. And in that sense, you know, being so hung up on the language that we stop doing anything because we're worried about making mistakes, it can be unhelpful. But I think if we're open to learning and to that progress, and the fact that language is going to change and develop and has different meanings to different people, it's really important to have that conversation.
I think so. The question was from Ben Peachy, who's one of the judges, and I feel like they may be asking, like, is the discourse about the language stopping us from having discourse about actual issues with the queer community? And I think that's a very good point to make. Like, there is this conversation about language, which is, you know, language is evolving. You know, talk to people in the language they feel comfortable in, but there are still so many other issues that, like, actual issues that need to be discussed, and we need to keep the focus on that as well.
Yeah, I think also an extension of that is, you know, if we just group ourselves together as queer, are we then ignoring specific bisexual or specific, you know, POC issues within the community, because everyone's queer? Because we as queer people don't all experience the same, you know, coming out, navigating spaces, you know, how we look walking down the street. So I guess there's some kind of importance there, like by grouping us all together as one, which obviously gives us strength and makes us feel confident in a lot of cases. Does that then ignore the specific issues that different groups in the community face?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, we've talked about it before, is intent. Like, what is your intent to have these conversations, to use this particular language, to use particular words? And I think you're right. I think there's bigger things happening that we need to be talking about, and I think in particular around, you know, the intersectionality around sexuality, gender and race that we've seen in the last 12 months, for example, is the bigger conversation. And I think, you know, it's important for us to have these conversations, but it shouldn't deter from the bigger issues that we should all be pushing behind and really driving for change. I think that language and labels are personal, and I don't think we're always going to get it right. But as long as our intent is coming from a good place, and it's coming from, you know, a place of kindness, of community, of encouragement, inclusivity, then you're rarely going to get it wrong. And yeah, it should be, you know, it's individual, and there's going to be some times we think, oh no, that's not for me. But yeah, never let it deter from the big issues that we should really be pushing towards.
I think it is an either or as well. We can talk about language, but sometimes those discussions will lead on to us talking about other things, like they are now by you raising this question, Ben. The fact that we're, you know, able to consider multiple issues and multiple intersectionalities at the same time, and work towards solving some of those, hopefully moving towards solving some of those bigger issues, while considering language and other issues that kind of we encounter along the way.
Gorgeous. So I think Steve is going to kick us off if we keep talking.
Not necessarily going to kick you off. I was just going to like bring it all together. That's actually a very good question to end on, I think, because one of the things that was interesting when I was coming up with the idea for the awards and thinking about the name for it was whether or not I used the word queer, because I knew it has kind of a polarization and kind of reception to it. And I've had feedback over the last 4 or 5 months since it's been out that's negative towards it, but it's generally been a positive sentiment towards it. But for me, this celebration and the shortlist that we're about to see is all about celebrating the young people and the people that are supporting them. And if that's what the word that they're using, that's the word that I felt was appropriate to use for the awards. Excellent. So thank you very much, Spencer and Mufseen, for that. You've done a fantastic job of leading the panel there. I'm sure the 4 panelists will agree.
Definitely.
Thank you. Nice talking.
Wonderful. And thank you to you, Alan, Annie, Harriet and Khadija for your insights there as well. Again, really powerful stuff that you're saying there that's hopefully going to start some conversations elsewhere from people that are listening to this today as well.